This morning, I want to catch you up a little bit on the journey, especially if you haven't been with us over the past several weeks. If you've missed any of the weeks, I encourage you to go back and subscribe to our YouTube page. There's a shameless plug there, but if you're looking for resources, find us on YouTube and you can catch our weekly podcast. But in week one, starting with chapter 1 of Jonah, we see Jonah's selfishness move him away from the call of God. We see Jonah go down and away. He had the opportunity to go to the people of Nineveh, some 500 miles away or less. Instead, he goes 2,500 miles away to Tarshish to flee the call that God had appointed him to do. And so Jonah in his selfishness then puts him and an entire crew at danger. The mariners on the boat, as a tempest came up on the sea and threatened to break apart the boat, Jonah goes to them and says, hey, listen, you need to go ahead and basically throw me overboard. Now, I don't know if you remember VeggieTales, but VeggieTales kind of messes this up for us because in the VeggieTales way of this story, they make it look like Jonah is being the hero of the story. Like, hey guys, just throw me over the boat. I'm here. I'll take a hit for the team. But it's not what's happening. Jonah in his selfishness would just rather die than to pursue the people of Nineveh, which were the Assyrian people. And so he literally jumps off of the boat and down into the depths he goes. And in chapter 2, we see God in his severe mercy meet Jonah in the depths of the sea as Jonah is swallowed up by a fish. And as he's swallowed up by a fish, he cries out to God. There's only 2 times in the book of Jonah that we see Jonah pray. Once in chapter 2 and the other in chapter 4. In chapter 2, he is begging for God's mercy. And in chapter 4, he is angry with God. And so in chapter 2, the fish spits Jonah out and he gets up on land and Jonah has a second chance. I want you to pay attention to the patience of God and the grace of God that is continuously moving towards Jonah as he saves his life from this fish. But Jonah is still not pleased with the call that God has on his life. And so in chapter 3, we see this sabotage of salvation from the prophet of Jonah. Jonah goes to the great city of Nineveh, some 3 days length in journey, and Jonah just does the bare minimum. He goes a day's journey into Nineveh, and he says 5 words in the original language to the Assyrian people of the city of Nineveh, and he basically says, you got 40 days or you're gonna be overthrown. And the hilarious part is that the entire city turned and repented to God, even though Jonah wanted to sabotage their salvation. And so now turning our attention to chapter 4, we're going to see Jonah's heart be fully exposed in this moment. And we're going to see the depths of his selfishness. We're going to see the callousness of his anger. And we're going to see just how much he did not want the people of Nineveh to be saved. Now, for further context, just so everybody's caught up, as a reminder, the Assyrian people were both brilliant and incredibly brutal. They were a murderous people who did very wicked things. And so you kind of understand why Jonah didn't want this to happen. Yet, we still see God and his grace and mercy spare the people of Nineveh. So now chapter 4. Do you think for a moment that Jonah would have been a little bit happy that the people would have been saved? Do you think that would have been the response? Because I know for me, being that I'm a pastor here, and I know if I gave a 5-word message and 120,000 people got saved, I think that there would be probably a little bit of pride in my heart that would try to creep up to say, good job, bro. You did a really solid job, right? You would think that Jonah in this moment would be in a spot where he is almost joyful that the people of Nineveh are finding the mercy of God. Yet that is the complete opposite of what we find Jonah doing here in chapter 4. Again, let's pay attention to the text. It says this: it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was angry. When we go back in the original language, he is calling out God and basically calling God evil. He's saying, this is evil what you are doing, God. This is why I didn't want to go to the people of Nineveh, because I knew your character. Jonah says, oh Lord, he gives it very plainly. He says, this is why I told you while I was still in my country, and this is why I made haste to flee. He says, I knew you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. I want us to pay attention this morning to Jonah's story again as a reflection of our own story. And I want you for a moment in the next few minutes that we have together to pay attention to just how selfish we are. And also pay attention to how callous we can become in our anger. Because what we're going to see here is three contrasts, in chapter 4. And I want us to pay attention to each movement, but also think of where your heart is today. And I'm going to give just a fair warning. It is a little bit more of a heavier message, okay? I'll give us some hope in the back end of this, but it's coming for you this morning, okay? A storm's a brewing, all right? So let's pay attention to the very first contrast. God's will versus our way. God's will versus our way. When we pay attention to Jonah's story, in the very beginning, he is displeased and mad at God, so much so that he is now waving his fist at God. He is fuming angry because what he thought should have happened to the Assyrian people was that God should wipe them off of the face of the planet. Jonah wanted disaster for them. He did not want God to relent in his punishment towards the Assyrians. And so Jonah's anger is kindled here. It is fuming hot. And Jonah is frustrated here because he thought he was going to get his way versus God's will. I don't know if you've ever been frustrated at God because you thought God was supposed to do something on your terms and on your way, except he didn't. And he did it in his terms and in his sovereign way. But this is what is happening here in the text. Jonah is frustrated that God is relenting against the people of Nineveh. And I just want to submit to you this morning that God's ways are in fact higher than our ways. And there are times in our life where we don't fully understand what God is doing, why he is doing it, and why he would do it the way that he does it. But I will make sure we understand this. His ways do not bow to our ways. We bow our knees to his will. And some of you need to hear that this morning because you are angry with God like Jonah is, because God didn't come through for you the way that you thought he should. He didn't do things on your terms. And so now you're like Jonah, outside of the will of God, outside of the city that you are called to be reaching. And you're sitting there complaining to God saying, this is why I didn't want to serve you. Because I knew you were gracious? Because I knew you were slow to anger? Because I knew you were abounding in love? Seems kind of confusing as to why Jonah is mad at the character of God in this moment. And if you pause for a moment and allow your heart to be cracked open for just a second, The times that we're mad at God for not coming through on our terms are oftentimes because we don't fully like God's character. Can you be really honest? And this is what I mean by this. Jesus calls us to love our enemies. One of the greatest ways that you can be following Christ, one of the greatest indicators and evidence of you submitting your life to Jesus is doing what Jesus commands us to do, which is to love our enemies. And in this moment, the reason why Jonah is angry with God is because God is showing mercy to Jonah's enemy. Okay. Think for a moment of a person in your life that has wronged you. Think for a moment of the coworker that you're really annoyed with in the office because they're pushing you down so that they could advance further, and you just really hope that they get what's coming to them. Or if you want to push down deeper below the surface, think for a moment of maybe the abuse that was occurred to you as a young teenager or child at the hands of someone who is incredibly broken. Think for a moment of someone who's wronged you and hurt you and broken you deeply. Now think for a moment for every person that's sitting in a jail cell today because of murders that they have committed. God's mercy and God's grace are for your enemies and is for everyone. Now look at your heart for a moment. The reason why we don't like that is because we are like Jonah. When you're thinking about the person that has wronged you, your response is not that they should receive mercy. Your response is that they should receive what's coming to them. That justice should be served. Anybody feel the tension in the room? And yet what God is doing and God is showing specifically to the people of Israel through the story of Jonah is that God's radical grace and his radical mercy is not reserved for just some special people. His mercy and his grace extends to all, to the worst of us. And our self-righteousness likes to separate ourselves from somebody else. But here's the hard reality, church. We're all human beings who are broken, fallen short of the glory of God. And what happens to us, what happens to humanity, is that whenever we see somebody that has done something wrong to us, we remove humanity from that person and we boil that person down to just the action that they did against us. You catch what I'm saying? No longer is that person a brother and sister in Christ. No longer is that person just another human being, but that person is the person who hurt you deeply. And this is what they did, and because that's what they did, they deserve wrath. They deserve what's coming to them. So do you feel the tension when Jesus calls us to love our enemies? Because some of you have not picked up the phone to call a family member that you have broken relationship with, and you are mad at them. And you are throwing a fit about that relationship outside of the city like Jonah is doing in this moment. And you're angry with God. Maybe because of the hurt that was occurred. And that's not me diminishing any hurt that has occurred. But maybe you're angry with him because you cannot imagine his grace and mercy saving them. Okay, let's lighten it a little bit. He goes outside of the city and he builds a little booth for himself, and he is waiting for what's coming to them to happen. He gets a bucket of popcorn, and Jonah's sitting out there, just sitting there waiting for the entertainment to happen. He's like, oh, God's got him. God's about to wipe them off the face of the earth. I'm about to see some hellfire rain down from heaven, and this is about to be really good. And he's just sitting there scheming. I can't wait for them to get what they deserve. Just scrolling through Instagram, scrolling through TikTok, scrolling through our news feed, waiting for something bad to happen to that one person. So you can just say, man, they finally got what's coming to them. I've been waiting this whole time. Right. We are more like Jonah than we like to give ourselves credit for. So Jonah is angry because God's will is trumping his way in this moment. And when you begin to get angry with God, your heart begins to grow calloused. And if you allow anger to sit in the sediment of your soul, it will rot your life. And when we become angry, we begin to ignore God. Look at what Jonah does in verse 4. And the Lord said, do you do well to be angry? Jonah is so angry in this moment, he doesn't even respond to God, y'all. He did the old school 90s talk to the hand move on God. He's so frustrated and so mad at God and his character for saving the people of Nineveh that God says gently back to him, please note, please pay attention to God's mercy and patience with Jonah this entire book. And God says, do you do well to be angry? I think he would say the same question to us this morning, church. Especially if you have some hurt that's happened in your life. Do you do well to be angry? And some of you might be in here and you're like, bro, I'm just like Jonah. Do not talk to me about what you're wanting to talk about right now because I will absolutely ignore it. And you've been running from it for 30 years. He says, do you do well to be angry? The second movement this morning that we need to pay attention to and contrast is our desires versus others' destinies. So Jonah went out of the city in verse 5 and sat east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. In verse 6, now the Lord appointed a plant. I love this. And made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his what? Discomfort. Do you see how gracious God is being to Jonah in this moment? He is throwing a massive pity party. He builds a little shade for himself, and then God says, you know what, I'll do one better. Here's a plant, Jonah. I'm gonna protect your head from getting sunburned right now. And I'm gonna ease your discomfort for just a moment. While Jonah is fuming mad at God. We need to pay attention to our desires versus others' destinies. So catch this picture for just a moment. He's now sitting there in the shade that God has provided for him while looking at the city that he wished was going to be destroyed. Instead, God relents. And in this moment, the prophet who's supposed to speak a word of salvation to the people is now more concerned with his comfort than he is the calling of Christ. Okay. This is where I have to get all of us. Because all of us, I'll say it this way, the greatest tactic that the enemy has in the church today is to make sure that you are so busy with your concerns and with your comforts that you miss the commission of God, which is to go and reach those around you. It's not that we do it intentionally. It's just that your calendars are so busy. It's just that you're so concerned with what you got going on throughout the week. You have to make sure you make a living, and you got to make sure that you're doing your best in school, and you got to make sure you're doing your best at the workplace. But we get so busy with our concerns and our little kingdoms that we completely miss the call of God to move towards his people. Jonah is sitting there waiting for a people group, 120,000 people. He is waiting for them to be destroyed. And if the enemy can get us to be more concerned about our comfort, we will never reach out to those around us who are about to be destroyed. We don't even think that way anymore, church. We live in a society and in a TikTok culture that's like, you know what, let's wrestle with the doctrine of hell. Is hell even there? Can we really judge people? I don't know about that. We don't want to talk about eternity. Because if we were to talk about eternity, and if we were to be serious about what Christ says in Scripture, then all of a sudden we have a serious mandate on our lives. But we're no better than Jonah in this moment, who's sitting there in his comfort with popcorn, waiting for this city to be destroyed, when our schedules are so consumed with ourselves and our concerns and our comforts that we don't even look up to the people around us anymore who are literally hurting and broken. Our desires versus other people's destiny, church. I told you it was a heavy message this morning. I'm not trying to hold any punches this morning because this is the conclusion of Jonah, and this is what this entire book is wanting us to see. That this thing is not about your comfort. I don't know how else to say it. We've institutionalized church so much. Please, I feel the tensions right now as we're trying to grow as a community, and more people are asking for more and more programs and more things and needing this and needing that. I'm like, guys, yes and amen. We'll get there, absolutely. But guess what? This isn't here to serve your needs. This isn't about your comfort. You are the church. My responsibility is to equip you to serve one another, the body. You're like, oh, the church is not meeting my needs. Well, when was the last time you met the needs of somebody else? When was the last time you looked up for a moment to see other people's concerns other than just yours? You see, what's powerful and what becomes an awakening in a city is when we die to our concerns and our comfort, and we start looking around to those around us to say, no, there is a city that is lost, and there's people who need me. And you're like, I can't reach a city. Guess what? You don't have to reach all of Conroe by yourself, yo. You got a workplace. You got a school that you go to. You got a career path that you're on. You got people who God has placed you strategically around right here for this moment, for such a time as this, to look up at them and say, that's the mission that God has called me to. That's the people group that God has called me to. That one gas station attendant, the same person that you pass in your local HEB, the same teacher that you teach alongside with, the person that's sitting across from you in your desk. Every single person is there because you are the saints, the body, the church, to reach those around us. It's not about our comfort. And I think the greatest tactic that we're seeing here in churches across America is that this is built for your comfort, and it is not built for your comfort or your convenience. And in this moment, Jonah's desires and Jonah's comfort is more important to him than the people who are in front of him. Last thing. Receiving versus resisting. There's a fly up here, guys. I'm trying to ignore it, really. I'm trying to do my best here. We also got new cameras, so you can probably see that in 6K now. The third contrast here is receiving versus resisting. Receiving versus resisting. And this is what I mean by this. Jonah in chapter 2 prayed out to God, and in chapter 4 prayed out to God. In chapter 2, Jonah was asking for God's mercy, crying out for God's mercy. And what we like is when God pours out his mercy and extends his mercy to us. But Jonah still resisted the call of God on his life to extend God's mercy to other people. This is what I mean. We like to receive his mercy, but we don't like to extend his mercy. We like to receive his mercy when it benefits us and gets us out of the depths and gets us back onto dry land. Praise God for your mercy. But the moment somebody wrongs you, no mercy. Because we like to receive it, but we don't like to extend it. And the call of God for Jonah in this moment is to extend the mercy of God to the people of Nineveh, yet he is so preoccupied with himself that it doesn't happen. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. Oh, I need to touch on this for just a second, backing up to the last point. This is the only time that Jonah was glad. He was glad because he got a plant to protect his head from the sun. He was not glad that 120,000 people were saved. When was the last time you rejoiced over somebody else's salvation? Oh, I'm glad when Jesus comes through for me. When was the last time you were joyful over somebody else's salvation? He says, but when dawn came up the next day, God appointed a worm to attack the plant so that it withered. God appointed a fish in chapter 2. God appoints a plant in chapter 4. And God appoints a worm, y'all. He also appoints the sun and the wind. And I love this little nuance here in the text. It says, and the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. He was faint. Poor little Jonah got exposed to a little Texas heat, y'all. He's like, I don't know what to do with this sunburn. I can't deal with it. I'm faint. I need some misters on my head right now. I need something to ease my discomfort. God, in this moment, his mercy is moved towards Jonah, but Jonah's heart is still hardened towards God. And so God, in his mercy again, in his severe mercy, removes the plant, and he causes the wind and the sun to sit there and beat down on Jonah. I think it's comical because Jonah is experiencing a little bit of heat and a little bit of discomfort, but he could care less about the people who were dying and about to go to hell in Nineveh, where the heat was incredibly extreme. It says he was faint. And he asked that he might die and said, it is better for me to die than to live. This second time around, Jonah does not say this back to God. He says this within himself. He says, I'd rather die than to live. But God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the plant? Some of you are so mad at God right now because he removed a little bit of comfort from your life. Do you do well to be mad? Do you do well to be angry at the plant? And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor, nor did you make it grow, which came into being in a night and perished in a night. Hear the heart of God, church. This is the point of the book of Jonah. Hear the heart of God. And should not I pity Nineveh? You pity a plant, Jonah. Should I not pity the lives of the humans that I created in my own image? He says there's 120,000 persons, and I love this. It ends on the livestock, y'all. Little Betsy that he was talking about in chapter 3, Betsy that was super sinful, Betsy the clown. You're like, so who's Betsy? Not the clown, I'm sorry, the cow. We do a really good job at receiving God's grace, but sometimes we struggle to extend his grace to others around us. And the call of God for us, church, is to make sure we understand that we are not supposed to be like Jonah in this text. We're not supposed to sit there and get angry at God whenever it's his will above our ways. We're not supposed to sit there and be angry with God whenever our desires and our comfort, all of that starts to get a little uncomfortable. Instead, we're supposed to move to the people around us. We're not supposed to be like Jonah, who gets angry and just wants to receive God's mercy for himself. Instead, we're supposed to be the people of God who show the mercy of God to those around us. If you're in here and you're hurt by church, or you're hurt by something that somebody did in the past, I'm just here to tell you that the grace of God, the love of God, the mercy of God is moving towards you. And I'm sorry for whatever person hurt you, but it was probably somebody who was too a little self-centered and cared more about their concerns, and maybe not had matured enough to realize that this thing isn't about them. But this is about the church of God being on the move for the people in the city who need us. And in order for that to be the case, church, we have to set aside our preferences. We have to set aside our comforts. We have to get over our anger, because what would it look like for a church to actually care about people the way that Christ calls us to care about people? When Jesus says to love your enemies, it wasn't just a little suggestion. You need to learn how to forgive the people around you so that you can begin to experience the mercy of God in your life, but then say, thanks be to God and his mercy and his grace that I get to extend this to the other human beings that are around me. Because you're not better. Because we're all the same. And no matter how much you want to prop yourself up on self-righteousness like Jonah did, no matter how much you want to be about yourself, the people around you, the people that you pass by every day, and the people that you're even angry with, remember that they are human beings created in the image of God, and his love and mercy reaches towards them. So what gives you the right to withhold grace and mercy? And when reconciliation happens like this, and I'm going to say this in the context of our growing community right now, the fastest thing that will break what God is doing in this particular season of Wake is for us to start getting angry with one another. Let that be far be it from this church. Let that not happen in this community. Let us learn to love each other well and extend grace and extend mercy when it is needed. So church, ask yourself 3 questions this morning. Technically 4, but 3 for reflection here. Are you mad at God today? Is there something that he didn't do on your terms that you really wish he would have done? This morning, would you evaluate your heart? And would you remind your soul that his ways are still higher, no matter how much pain, no matter how much misery? And instead of being mad at God this morning, there's an invitation for you to bow your knee in humility, saying, God, would you see me through this? Secondly, are you Are you more concerned about your comfort than the destiny of others? Has this thing become so much about you that you cannot see the people around you that God has placed before you? Thirdly, are you on mission? And you're like, dude, I'm new to church. Are you calling me to make a decision like Mission Impossible? No. The mission of God, which is the grace and mercy of God for all people. Are you on mission, especially as you consider the context of your schools and your workplaces, as you consider the context of your families? Are you reaching out to them and extending the same grace and mercy that God has extended to you? And lastly, if you feel like, man, that sounds good and all, but I'm too broken, and there's no way that God wants to use my story. You don't understand the circumstance that I'm in right now, and you don't understand the pain that has happened in my life. Man, God sees you in this moment. Please hear me. God sees you in this moment. And his mercy and grace are moving towards you. And there is no story that is so far gone that cannot be redeemed by the goodness of God. And all he asks, the only invitation for you, is that you would fully surrender your life to him, understanding that he is Lord and understanding that he died on the cross for you. You're not too far gone. He's moving towards you this morning. So church, evaluate your heart, and let's make sure we're not being like Jonah's this morning. Hey, thank you so much for tuning in to this week's message on our Wake Church YouTube channel. I pray that this was an encouragement to you and that you are challenged to grow deeper in your faith. If this message has encouraged you, do us a favor and go ahead and share it with a friend. And make sure to subscribe to this channel for more weekly content just like this, and you'll be notified when we go live on Sunday mornings. Lastly, we want to say thank you for your generosity. If you'd like to support our mission, you could go to wakechurch.com/give or simply click on the give button on the screen. Thanks again for tuning in. We love you.